You are now listening to Mark's Unexplained World by Mark the Medium, available on Apple Podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Podbean and most other podcast platforms. Tonight's episode is about Donald and Gua. So it's over to you now, Mark.
On the 26th of June in 1931, the comparative psychologist Winthrop Kellogg and his wife Luella Dorothy welcomed a new arrival into their home. However, this new arrival was not a human infant per se, but was in fact a female baby chimpanzee named Gua that the couple planned to raise alongside their own baby boy named Donald. The idea was to see how the domestic environment could influence the chimp's development and to see if Gua would not only eventually grow up to behave like a human but also start to think that she was human. Gua was brought into the Kellogg's home at the age of just 7.5 months old and reared together with their son Donald, who was 10 months old at the time. And for the next 9 months, Donald's parents raised the two as brother and sister, comprehensively recording both the development of the chimpanzee and that of their own human child. When Gua was around 1 year old, the female chimp would often test ahead of Donald in such tasks as responding to simple commands or the use of a cup and spoon. However, the slight differences in their placement included people recognition, in that Gua would recognise people from the clothes that they were wearing along with their smell, whilst Donald, on the other hand, would recognise people by their faces. However, the parting difference came with language, and when Donald was about 16 months old and Gua was just a little over a year old, they both had language testing. Gua could not speak, but Donald could form words, and on the 28th of March in 1932, just 9 months into the experiment, the Kelloggs officially ended it, as Donald began to mimic the sounds that were being made by Gua. Greetings, Unexplainers. Thank you for tuning in again and listening to this Oh to Be a Chimp or Not episode of Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm a medium, a ufologist, a true crime buff, and a man with a very dark and disturbed sense of humour who suspects that someone has been adding soil to his garden, so the plot thickens. But just to give you a better idea of who I am and what I do, every week, usually on a Tuesday night, though occasionally on a Wednesday, allowing for bank holidays and busy weekends, I do a podcast on the many wide and various subjects that fall under the Unexplained banner. These include ufology, hauntings, disasters, and all sorts of other paranormal phenomena, including true crimes, unsolved crime, serial killers, the darker side of some past celebrities, and the occasional missing person that often goes unnoticed. So, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review or an opinion of this episode's subject that I can reply to, a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell. Or, if you are listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. And if you do get a few minutes, perhaps you might like to check out my social media groups and pages, including Facebook, Instagram and TikTok, which are filled daily with all things unexplained and crime. I'll put the link to some of my socials in the description. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about the experimental story surrounding Donald and Gua. And this week's necessary disclaimer, well, there is nothing to ring any major alarm bells about this episode, but as you have probably gathered by the name of the show, I do touch on several experiments involving young children and animals, and some of you may find the theme upsetting, so you do listen at your own discretion. But remember, as with all my shows, all opinions and comments are strictly my own, but the facts of the case still remain. I also apologise if I pronounce anything incorrectly. My English, even though it is my first and only language, when I asked the IT guy the other day, how do you make a motherboard, he replied by telling me that he tells her about his job. But anyway, let us get back to the story. So, the first question we should ask ourselves is, what is comparative psychology? Well, according to Wikipedia, comparative psychology is the scientific study of the behaviour and mental processes of non-human animals, specifically relating to the phylogenetic history and adaptive significance, along with the development of their behaviour. The phrase comparative psychology may be employed in either a narrow or a broad meaning, with its narrow meaning referring to the study of the similarities and differences in the psychology and behaviour of different species, and the broader meaning relating to the comparative psychology, which includes the comparisons between different biological and social cultural groups, such as species, sexes, ages, developmental stages and ethnicities. Research in this area addresses many different issues, uses many different methods and explores the behaviour of many different species, from the insect to the primate. Comparative psychology is sometimes assumed to emphasise cross-species comparisons, including those between humans and animals. However, some researchers feel that direct comparisons should not be the sole focus of comparative psychology, and that intense focus on a single organism, or to understand its behaviour, is just as desirable, and that using a comparative approach to behaviour allows one to evaluate the target from 4 different complementary perspectives, which are:
Number 1.
First, one may ask how pervasive the behaviour is across the species, or in other words, how common is the behaviour between the animals.
Number 2.
One may ask how the behaviour contributes to the lifetime reproductive success of the individuals, i.e. does the behaviour result in animals producing more offspring, with these theories addressing the ultimate causes of behaviour being based on the answers to these 2 questions.
Number 3.
What mechanisms are involved in the behaviour, i.e. what psychological, behavioural and environmental components are necessary and sufficient for the generation.
And number 4.
That a researcher may ask about the development of the behaviour with an individual, i.e. what maturational, learning and social experiences must an individual undergo to demonstrate its behaviour. I think I got that word out. Winthrop Niles Kellogg, who was born on the 13th of April in 1898 in Mount Vernon, New York, began an undergraduate study in 1916 at Cornell University for 1 year before joining World War I in Europe, and for 2 years he served as part of the American Expeditionary Forces in the US Army Air Service. After the war, Winthrop Kellogg returned to undergraduate study at Indiana University, Bloomington, and there he met Luella Dorothy Ager of Indianapolis, whom he would later marry in 1920. After Winthrop Kellogg graduated from Indiana in 1922, majoring in philosophy and psychology, he then tried out several jobs, including journalism, but was persuaded by Luella's uncle to have a go at academia, which, just in case you didn't know, was the part of society that is connected with studying and thinking. So, following Luella's uncle's advice, he enrolled in the psychology program at Columbia University, where in 1927 he received his master's, and just 2 years later, in 1929, he received his doctorate. Even as a graduate student, Winthrop Kellogg was a prolific researcher, with his published works, in addition to his dissertation, including 4 single-authored articles and 1 co-authored in 1928 to 1929, followed by, in 1930, an additional 3 articles and another 5 in 1931, sustaining this level of activity throughout his academic career. In 1963, Winthrop Kellogg officially retired from the Florida state, and he and his wife, Luella, spent much of their remaining days together, travelling to various parts of the world. They both passed away in the summer of 1972. Gua was a female chimpanzee who was born on the 15th of November in 1930 in Havana, Cuba, and was given, along with her mother Patty and her father Jack, to the Old Orange Park in Florida, which was the site of the Yerkes Regional Primate Research Center by Pierre Abreu on the 13th of May in 1931, after the death of his mother, Madame Rosalia Abreu, who was a Cuban philanthropist and animal keeper who was the first person to successfully breed chimpanzees in captivity. Gua was brought into the Kellogg home at the age of 7.5 months old and reared alongside their son Donald, who was just 10 months old at the time, and for the next 9 months Kellogg's raised both Donald and Gua as brother and sister, comprehensively recording the development of the chimpanzee and the human child. After this short break, in part 2, we will look at the start of the Donald and Gua experiment.
Ghost Planet Network, broadcasting from the other side. Ready to tune in to terror? The Ghost Planet Network is your new home for original paranormal content, streaming straight from beyond the veil. We have got it all: spine-tingling stories, chilling documentaries, and real paranormal investigations from the world's most haunted hotspots. Perfect for believers, skeptics, and anyone who loves a good scare. Join the paranormal TV revolution. Get unlimited access for just £12 per year. Tune in now, or email us at neil.haprick@gmail.com to sign up. That's neil.haprc@gmail.com.
In 1931, soon after arriving in Indiana, Winthrop Kellogg began to plan an ambitious project concerning the comparative psychology of primates. In his article called Humanising the Ape, Kellogg argued for the necessity of the comparative developmental studies of humans and non-human primates, with him mainly being interested in determining the relative influence of nature and nurture on behaviour. So, Winthrop Kellogg proposed to raise an infant chimpanzee along with his own infant son Donald, and I think it is reasonably safe to say that no other project in his career would bring him quite as much attention as this project would. Winthrop Kellogg originally generated this idea during the graduate time at Columbia University, where he studied psychology, and it is supposed that this idea was sparked by an article which he came across called The Wolf Children of India. On an interesting side note here, the Wolf Children of India were two feral girls called Amala and Kamala from Mignapur, Bengal, currently West Bengal in India, from 1926, who were alleged to have been raised by a family of wolves. Their story attracted substantial mainstream attention and debate. However, the account was reported and promoted by only one source, and that was by a clergyman who claimed to have discovered the girls. And because of this, there was some controversy as to the authenticity of the story, and the French surgeon Serge Aroulet concluded in his book Enigma of the Wolf Children, published in 2007, that the story was a hoax. I will be taking a closer look at the subject of feral children later in this podcast. Winthrop Kellogg argued regarding these wolf children and those like them that they were all born with a normal intelligence, otherwise it was unlikely that they would have survived, asserting that these children learned to live like wolves because that was, and I quote, what their environment demanded of them, believing in the strong impact of the early experience along with the existence of any other critical periods in their development, and maintaining that the problem with civilising feral children was the difficulty of overturning any habits that they had learnt during their early years or early lives. And of course it goes without saying, although I will say it anyway, that the idea of placing a human infant of normal intelligence in an uncivilised environment and observing its development in that environment would not only be unethical, but it is also not legal. So, according to Winthrop Kellogg, the only other way to test this question of environment versus heredity would be to take a, and I quote, wild animal and place it in a civilised environment of a human home. And although there have been earlier attempts to get this question concerning civilised apes, none of them met the strict criteria that Winthrop Kellogg thought was necessary, especially the criterion of a, and I quote, situation that would assure that the animal was always treated as a human and never as an animal, or particularly a pet. In order to help prepare for his, for the want of a better word, experiment, or project even, Winthrop Kellogg received the help from both the Social Science Research Council Fellowship to work at the Yale Anthropoid Station in Florida, and the American psychologist who was best known for his work in intelligence testing in the field of comparative psychology, Robert Yerkes. To Winthrop Kellogg's surprise, and soon after his family moved to Florida, he learnt that another post-doctoral fellow named Carlisle Jacobson had been studying an infant ape since its birth for a year prior, and to Kellogg's benefit, there had been no clear attempt to humanise the ape. So, on the 26th of June in 1931, the Kelloggs brought home the 7-month-old chimpanzee named Gua, with the intention being that the animal was to become a fully fledged and adopted member of the family, along with being a companion in the games and development of their son Donald, which included dressing in similar clothes, being fed at the same time, given the same toys, and put to sleep in cribs next to each other, with 10-month-old Donald and 7.5-month-old Gua being treated as equally as possible, which also included being dressed, bathed, fed and taught in a similar manner. However, unfortunately and over time, this experiment would soon be called disturbing, as for 9 months Winthrop Kellogg, along with his wife Luella, conducted various experiments on both their own son Donald and Gua the chimpanzee for 12 hours every day, with the resourcefulness of the boy's parents being described as astounding. They would spin their son and monkey around on chairs, unexpectedly fire a pistol behind their backs, and force them to perform meaningless, monotonous actions for long periods of time, with the psychologist carefully recording all the observations in photographs, film and detailed notes, whilst the Kelloggs conducted a number of tests to measure their development as regularly as possible. And, as one might expect, Gua grew faster than Donald and even learned some behaviours more quickly, and was seemingly more dependent on human interaction and support than his human counterpart, meaning Donald, of course, appeared to be. And although Gua progressed quite impressively in acquiring everyday human behaviours, she did not meet Winthrop Kellogg's expectations, with the reason being that Gua made no effort to communicate via human language. The scientists originally planned to continue the Donald and Gua experiment for 5 years. However, it had to be urgently interrupted after just 9 months for an unexpected reason. You see, psychologists found out that it appeared that after Gua was treated as a human child, she started to behave like a human child, except when the structure of her body and brain prevented her. However, the main reason for this abrupt ending was that over time, Donald began to resemble the behaviour of a chimpanzee more and more, by grunting, demanding food, fighting with Gua in a completely monkey-like manner, and even began to bite people. The other thing that the psychologist, and no doubt Donald's parents as well, were concerned about was that the chimpanzee was growing older and becoming stronger, and that Donald was noticeably inferior to her in physical development. So there were fears that the monkey could accidentally or even intentionally harm him. So, with this behaviour being shown, the experiment was discontinued, and after just 9 months of work, the study ended on the 28th of March in 1932, 4 years and 3 months short of the initial 5-year project. I'm going to take just a short break from the Donald and Gua case and have a look at the subject surrounding the feral child. A feral child, which is also known as a wild child, is a young individual who has lived isolated from human contact from a very young age, with little or no experience of human care, social behaviour and or language skills, with these children lacking the basics of primary and secondary socialisation. The term feral is used to refer to children who have suffered severe abuse or trauma before being abandoned or running away, and are sometimes the subjects of folklore and legends, often portrayed as having been raised by animals. And while there are many cases of children being found in proximity to wild animals, there are no eyewitness accounts of animals feeding human children. Prior to the 1600s, feral and wild children's stories were usually limited to myths and legends, and in those tales a depiction of feral children would include hunting for food, running on all fours instead of two, and not knowing or having even any language skills. Originally, philosophers and scientists, as an understanding of humans in the natural world in the 18th and 19th century, were interested in the concept of such children, and as such began to question if these minors were part of a different species from the human family. And as this question was taken seriously, science tried to name and categorise the development of such humans, and at or on around the 20th century, psychologists were attempting to differentiate between the biological behaviour and the culture, with feral children who lived in isolation or with animals providing examples of this dilemma. Feral children often seem mentally impaired and have almost insurmountable trouble learning a human language due to the impaired ability to learn it after having been isolated for so many years, which is often attributed to the existence of a critical period for language learning and taken as evidence in favour of the critical period hypothesis, which is a crucial moment when within the field of linguistics and second language acquisition that claims a person can only achieve native-like fluency in a vocabulary before a certain age. After this second short break, in part 3, we will go back to the Donald and Goa case, the legacy and the sad results for both parties.
Fright Nights was established in 1999 as the first company in the world to offer overnight ghost hunt experiences to the general public, pioneering paranormal events since the last century. Fright Nights operate at hundreds of the UK's most haunted and exclusive venues. All events have their own team of experienced paranormal investigators, mediums and psychics. They have a VIP members club for regular returning guests, offering loyalty discounts and exclusive invitation-only events. They can also host private events for your family and friends. You can contact them on 07 852 998 628 or email them at office@frightnights.co.uk. or take a look at their website at www.frightnights.co.uk, where you can see the many locations they investigate and learn about them and the opportunities they have available. Hundreds of ghost hunters join Fright Nights every month for the most thrilling ghost hunting experiences they'll never forget. If you haven't been on a ghost hunt before, then why not join them to see what it's all about? Why not visit their social media sites for up-to-date information on all the places they visit and to see what's coming up in the future? They look forward to seeing you all soon. Fright Nights Ghost Hunting Events. Remember, only the original will do.
After the experiment was discontinued, Goa, who had lived among people for almost a year, was returned to the monkey nursery in Indiana, and since the chimpanzee had no experience communicating with her own kind, her fellow chimpanzees didn't exactly accept her back into the fold with open arms, so as a result, Goa had to be locked in a separate enclosure where the poor animal stayed for the rest of her life, which was also unfortunately not very long, as only a year after her returning to the nursery, at just 3 years old, she died of a heart attack. Although this might seem like a strange study, by today's standards anyway, we cannot help but ask ourselves what exactly were the scientists of almost 100 years ago trying to achieve. Well, their task, or project even, was later formulated by the psychologist, writer and populariser of science Theodore Dumas, who said, and I quote, "These scientists planned to continue the experiment for 5 years, but it had to be urgently interrupted after 9 months for an unexpected reason. No, Gua did not turn into a human during this time, but Donald began to resemble a chimpanzee more and more. He grunted, demanded food, fought with Gua in a completely monkey-like manner, and even began to bite." Adding that this experiment would prove to be one of Winthrop Kellogg's most pioneering studies, with him for 9 months straight, mind, maintaining identical rearing conditions for both his own son Donald and the chimpanzee Gua, using tasks to test the infants both comparatively and developmentally. Though the very heart of the project was an attempt to discover how a human and a chimpanzee could become when reared in human conditions, Winthrop Kellogg had formulated it to be the definitive investigation explaining the interaction between heredity and the environment, with the study proving to demonstrate the limits of heredity regardless of the setting, and in addition to the developmental gains that were induced by enriched surroundings. And, as I stated earlier, although Gua never met Winthrop Kellogg's expectations of human language, meaning that she was never able to imitate human vocalizations, the same could not be said for Donald, as over time he started to imitate a few of Gua's vocalizations, including what they would later call the food bark whenever food was presented or nearby. A portion of the results from the Donald and Gua project were presented at the annual meeting of the Midwestern Psychological Association, and soon after, Winthrop Kellogg, along with his wife Luella, began writing a book on the experiment called The Ape and the Child, which was published back in 1933, and, according to reports, it actually documents the study very well. And also, again, according to reports, due to the book itself being written in such a way that it would appeal to the general public, it was no surprise that the news media, such as the New York Times and the Science newsletter, would also soon start to publish articles about the project. However, I do feel I should point out here that although Winthrop Kellogg had assessed the development of language and had expectations for Gua, the project goal was not about teaching human language to an ape, and that only part of one chapter in the book, The Ape and the Child, deals with this part of the experiment. Despite Winthrop Kellogg's enthusiasm for the psychological, anthropological and biological significance of the study, it was not safe or free even from any criticism, with his biggest critics being his colleagues, the public, after having read the aforementioned book, and even his wife Luella, with some stating that the project was inhumane by pointing out its undesirability of using an infant as an experimental subject for an extended period of time, while others disapproved of the separation of Gua from her mother and other chimpanzees. And additionally, since the study had been written and published in such a public-friendly way, and then picked up by the media, some critics characterised the project as one seeking publicity and excitement. However, Winthrop Kellogg's Donald and Gua study did and still does have its legacy, as much later on it inspired the novelist Karen Joy Fowler to write the book We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, which was a fictional account of a similar experiment also set at Indiana University and was published in 2013. So, one of the questions you are probably pondering over is, what happened to Winthrop and Luella's son, Donald Kellogg? Well, unfortunately, when the experiment came to its abrupt end, like the unfortunate story around Gua, nothing positive happened to Donald either, as apparently the project had left him with deep psychological trauma, growing up both withdrawn and indecisive. What a surprise. And even as an adult, he remained living at his parents' house, so that, just a few weeks after his last parent passed away, he was left alone. And in 1973, sadly at the young age of just 43 years old, he committed suicide.
Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. In our next episode, show number 173, we are going to be looking at the survival story of Julian Kopek. Julian Kopek is a German-Peruvian mammalogist who specialises in bats. She is also the daughter of German zoologists Maria and Hans Wilhelm Kopek, and the sole survivor of the 1971 Lanza Flight 508 air crash. When the plane was struck by lightning, she fell 3,000 metres, or 10,000 feet, while strapped in her seat and suffered numerous injuries, including a concussion, broken collarbone and a torn knee ligament. However, despite all her injuries, she managed to survive for 11 days alone in the Peruvian Amazon rainforest until she located civilization at a lumberjack camp.
This show was written and researched by myself, Mark Hughes, proofread and edited by Linda Hughes, with the pronunciations of all the names of places being me. The actors in this episode are Mark Hughes, Linda Hughes and Denise Poolar, with special thanks to Neil Packer and the staff at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre in Hinckley, and of course a big thank you to everyone for listening. We never run out of ideas here at the office for the Mark's Unexplained World podcast, but if you do know of any other intriguing stories under the Unexplained banner, including ufology, hauntings, disasters and any other sort of paranormal phenomena, as well as true crime, unsolved crime and missing people, just drop me a direct message and I will see what I can do. I'll also include the name of the person who suggested the idea in the end credits of the podcast, if they're happy for me to do so, of course. And again, just to add, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. I thank you in advance. Mark's Unexplained World, because there's more to the paranormal than meets the third eye. And remember guys, keep it real, because being real is better than being perfect. No AI was used or harmed in the making of this or any other episode of Mark's Unexplained World. This show and all its contents are covered by basic copyright of Mark the Medium.